Well, hello. I am Hilary Harper from ABC Radio Melbourne, the Saturday program, and I'd like to acknowledge that we're meeting on the traditional lands of the Kulin Nation tonight, where sovereignty was never ceded, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and to the elders of any other communities who may be with us today. You might notice that this evening is going to be Auslan interpreted, so welcome to Dave and Kiri, who are going to help us out with that. Welcome to the last in the Dead Calm series, which I have absolutely loved bringing you this year. It was very bizarre going to the Wheeler Centre and saying, I would like to talk about death at length and in depth 4 times. And they went, how big a room do you need? So it's been amazing being able to talk about these really big issues, grief and remembrance and end-of-life care, and seeing your faces leaning into that. And tonight we're going to cover some of the biggest questions of all. When do we stop being a person and become a corpse? How should we treat our beloved husks? And what if a living person needs part of our bodies after we die? There'll be questions afterwards, and remember that if any of tonight's discussions raise some issues for you, just flag down a staff member. We have a little quiet space that we can use for recovering in. And you're in very good hands tonight. Dominique Martin is with us. She's a senior lecturer in health ethics and professionalism at Deakin University, and she specialises in issues around how we manage human biological materials. Rohit DeCosta is the Medical Director of Donate Life Victoria, the state's organ donation coordination service. He's also an intensive care specialist at the Royal Melbourne Hospital. And big thanks to Pia Interlandi, who stepped in at the last minute after another guest had to pull out. She makes garments for the grave, clothes that transition with people from corporeality to dust. She's also a funeral celebrant and a co-founder and chair of the Natural Death Advocacy Network. Please welcome them. Rohit, if I could start with you, is there a scientific consensus on when we stop being a human being and become remains?
Well, we know that death is an actual process, and there's been, I guess, a societal and medical need to define a point at which you can say, you know, this is death has occurred.
In legal terms, at least. And
certainly a legal requirement. So in Victoria, for example, there's the Human Tissue Act, which legally specifies when death has occurred, and it simply states that the process has become irreversible. So, you know, if you think about that, that's a little bit nebulous as well. So what we do as doctors is we look at the earliest time that we can actually say that someone's dead with confidence. And back in the day, it used to be, you know, 3 days. People worried about, you know, 3 or 4 days or 10 days, and now it's a matter of, we've got it down to a matter of minutes or seconds. But
are you ever wrong?
Are we ever wrong? Well, generally not. Certainly, I don't know of in modern medicine a point where someone has been wrong, but you know, I think we're always humble and we accept that we can be wrong.
Well, and I imagine when it comes to organ donations, the timelines must be very pressing. You
Yes.
need to know you have a schedule you can work with.
Absolutely, and I think you know, one of the most important things with death, in the traditional sense that we think of someone's heart stopping and the circulation stopping. As soon as the circulation is not effective, then the organs start to suffer. So we want to make sure that if we are retrieving organs for donation, that occurs at the shortest possible interval, and that's usually a matter of minutes to, you know, a couple of hours at most.
You do hear stories, though, of people who are without oxygen for a period of time, maybe up to minutes, and who are resuscitated. Is there ever a worry that you're saying, well, this person was terminal anyway, so we'll just let that process happen?
And this is where intent comes into it. So there are a lot of people who technically, medically, you might be able to restart their circulation. But if there was never any intent to do it, and you know, there's consensus from sometimes the person themselves or their family and medically that it's not the right thing to do to restart the circulation, then that becomes moot. That, you know, it may be theoretically possible to restart the circulation, but it was never intended.
And there's also, I guess, we have this deep need to know that whatever makes that person them is not there anymore.
Yeah.
And it's fascinating to think of that as a process and a transition. We used to think of the person residing in the heart or the brain. Is there an idea of which part of brain functioning or circulatory functioning means that that person is not there anymore?
I think certainly in Western society, I think we look at the brain as being central to life. And, a number of families will say to me, they might have been in intensive care for many, many days, and we might come to a point where it's clear that they're not going to survive. And they will say to me, look, well, I know that John, I knew he was gone from the minute he had the accident. To me, he died then. And, that's very meaningful and true, but, on the death certificate, we still have to have this date, which is I guess the time that physiology has seized, or that we've determined that the process has become irreversible.
Can you give us a précis of what happens physiologically speaking when the body dies?
Look, it can vary, and the reality is medical technology has intervened so much in the process. So we talk, particularly with organ donation, we talk about this concept of brain death. And really what we're talking about is a state where the circulation is intact, but the brain has completely lost all its function, and therefore it has died. So the person has died legally. But we're able to support the circulation through artificial means by using a ventilator, which can pump air into the lungs, so the person can't breathe because they're dead, so in that sort of sense, you've got an intact, warm person who you can touch and feel, and they feel alive in inverted commas, but they're actually dead. More commonly, what most of us, including myself, would think of as dying is someone who's lost their circulation, which is by far the most common way to die, and that can be very quick in someone who's very unstable and a lot of medical supports, or it could be a more gradual process that could take hours. But ultimately, it's this loss of consciousness and loss of brain function that seems to be central.
Dominic, I wonder if I could ask you if the bioethics realm has a view on where we reside as people in our bodies.
I think, like many things in the bioethics realm, we have many views. To be fair, though, I think there are also different medical views or some disagreements within the medical community now about death and that determination. As I guess Rohit said, it is so important to be able to define a time, because ethically speaking, we want to be able to distinguish between the interests of people who are alive and the interests that may exist for people after death. And there's a lot of disagreement about whether you can have any interests that need to be respected after that moment at which you become dead. We recognising now that it's very hard to define that point precisely. We can define it legally, we can define it clinically, but culturally and socially and ethically speaking, it really is a grey zone, I guess. And so what we are now struggling with in the bioethics community in conjunction with clinicians is to work out, are there new definitions of death or a new way of determining that point, the critical point, and what do we do with the grey zones around it? And for example, with donation and so-called brain death, there was recently a case some of you may have heard about in America where a young girl was determined to be dead by neurological criteria, brain dead, after she suffered a terrible complication after having a tonsillectomy. And so legally speaking, she was dead by United States law. However, her family didn't support that. They felt that she wasn't dead. They actually felt that she wasn't brain dead. And her body has remained biologically alive with all of those external supports in the form of ventilation and medications, and remained biologically alive for 4 years until I think it was June this year when that process ended, and her family said at that point she had died. So there is disagreement, and some philosophers now suggest, well, it doesn't matter. We can't have certainty around it, and we should stop worrying about it so much.
But that would have implications for not only organ donation regimes, but
it would have incredible
after-death
implications.
processes.
Yeah, and I think it is vital that we do try and achieve that certainty and make sure that we have sufficient consensus so that we can make those ethically important distinctions. And I guess nowhere is more important than in a healthcare setting where we need to determine, are we going to take organs or tissues from a person? Are we going to take them forward to burial? All of those sorts of decisions, we need to have some degree of certainty about when a person is dead.
There's a really interesting argument around one of the plastinated bodies exhibitions in recent years, where they could not prove that some of the bodies were not potentially those of Chinese torture and political prisoner executions. And it raised the question for me of, why does it matter? Why do we need the consent of someone whose body is going to go on display in very bizarre forms when they're dead?
That to me? That's a big question for many reasons. Thinking about, I guess, why does it matter ethically? Personally, I think it matters ethically because it has so many implications for how we treat the living. And if we look at all those areas of contention where people are worried that we are not treating dead bodies with sufficient respect, we're really most concerned because what that means for the way we're treating the living. And so the case of the bodies that were taken from China and the concerns about the use of executed prisoners, people in China until recently were being executed, often for the purpose of removing organs for transplantation. They were people who weren't in a position to consent to donation, and they were people from communities potentially who were very wrongly treated. So whether or not you agree with capital punishment, whether or not you agree with taking organs from people after they're dead without their consent, a whole constellation of factors which said these are very vulnerable people who are exploited and who have been harmed.
And it was an economic system at work too, wasn't it?
Exactly, a lot of conflicts of interest. So taking the bodies of those people and using them in that way, I think sent and continues to send very distressing messages for the way the people who are members of those communities and who are alive today in China, who perhaps have got their lives at risk. Those are the people we're worried about, I think, when we're worried about those bodies.
I went to one of the other exhibitions that they assured me they had all their consent forms and it was all in order. And I still found it really confronting. Like, it was fascinating. And it was an incredible teaching tool, I imagine, if you were taking kids of an age that was appropriate. But there's just something very strange about seeing somebody's nervous system splayed out in a cabinet. I don't know if you've seen that, Pia.
I actually went the other day,
Yeah.
about 2 days ago. My question about the Body Worlds exhibition and the permanent preservation of bodies is, do we need to? Particularly 3D modelling, 3D printing, do we still need, is there any benefit of them being from real people? And certainly overseas they acknowledge that these have come from donated human beings, but I didn't see that in the one in Melbourne, actually, where it's sort of taken for granted that these were living human beings. And I think that that's the only point of using humans for that particular context, is to acknowledge that these are wonderful, generous people who've donated their bodies to education. So when you take the fact that they're real bodies away from it, and the coloration of the muscle tone and all that sort of thing isn't particularly real, is there a point to donating your body for that purpose?
So let's talk about some of the work that you do, because you work with people who become dead bodies and you get to see those transitions.
Yeah, and it's profound and amazing and beautiful and bittersweet and cathartic, and it's very, very surreal. But within the context of what I do, David Eagleman wrote a book which is Some 40 Tales of the Afterlife, and one of the short stories has that there are 3 deaths. There is the moment you stop breathing, there is the moment that your body is surrendered to the earth, and then there is the moment that your name is spoken for the final time. And each of those has this kind of pang that goes along with it. But the body is incredibly important. It is in this state of transition, and it may not be alive, but it's still imbued with cultural, ethical, spiritual, emotional meaning. So it needs to be addressed. And for people who turn around and say, oh, I don't care, do whatever you want, that actually leaves the family in a very vulnerable position where the decisions they need to make, and often very quickly, they're not secure on. So,
what, if you want to keep a body at home, of a loved one who's died at home, what needs to be done to that body?
not much. Generally, keeping them cool. So embalming is not necessary. We are in a, time where we have things like air conditioning. But when we take someone home, we use either a cooling mat or a cooling blanket, which is something that pumps cold water around what looks like a blanket, and you put it underneath the quilt, and it keeps the body very cool, so that you're just slowing the process of decomposition, which gives the family enough time to do what they need to do.
Do you need to take any safety measures, reduce loss of fluids, things like that?
Look, I tend to think about dead bodies as there's nothing you wouldn't do if this was your child. You're going to wipe their nose, change diaper, and sometimes, and a lot of the time, that doesn't happen to dead bodies. So it's pretty sensible. Just wash your hands. Don't touch the dead person and then eat. If there are fluids, be careful, but there's not danger. You're not going to catch death. So that's one of the things, that this is a body that you looked after when they were dying, for a lot of the families we're involved with. So they've done all that stuff. There's nothing that changes dramatically between that moment of death and the next few days afterwards.
Well, it's interesting that there's a few days sometimes, because I wonder how long that transition needs to be for a lot of the families that you work with.
It can be anywhere from overnight. They can go home for an hour. They can stay at home for 3 days, which tends to be the average. 5 days, 10 days. The family will reach a natural point where they say they're ready, or we're ready now. And that's a huge transformation for a family to undergo, particularly if it's a sudden death or a traumatic death. So they watch the body change in a really slow, there's no kind of suddenly they're a zombie. It's slow. You'll have, sinking. I talk about gravity as something that's really powerful in death, that the heart stops beating. So everything that's being pushed around the body stops, and slowly everything sinks. So that's why you get sunken eyes. It's why you get things like livor mortis, where, you've got pooling of blood in the back. And you explain all these things to the family. You warn them in advance, this is what will happen, this is natural. And so they're not surprised, but they get to a point where they're either definitely not in there anymore, or they need to go now.
Yeah. For some of you who've been to these events before might know that I lost 2 babies a few years ago, midway through the pregnancy, and the second one was at 20 weeks, so they're officially, legally were a person, and so they get a death certificate, and things flow on from that, in that we got a separate room at the hospital, and we could be with our baby for a little while. And that was an unbelievably powerful thing, to be a family together and have him with us for a day and a night.
Yep, absolutely.
And I was so grateful for that, whereas if you'd asked me beforehand, I would have been like, I don't know, that's very confronting. But yeah, you get a chance to say goodbye. Rohit, I'm wondering, does the necessary processes in organ donation, do they prohibit families being able to have that transition time and being able to say goodbye properly?
It can vary with some of the time requirements. It can mean that between the circulation ceasing and the person going to the operating theatre for the organ donation procedure, that could be a matter of a few minutes, and so that can be 5 minutes sometimes, and we do counsel families about that. We, clearly, that may not be right for all families.
Can they come back after?
Then they come back, yeah. So generally, it varies from hospital to hospital, but at my hospital, for example, we keep the bed there if the family so chooses, so that the person can come back to the intensive care unit, and the family can spend as much time as they want with them.
That would be amazing, I think, not to have everyone everything cleaned out immediately.
Yeah.
Dominique, do you have thoughts about that? The kind of the way we feel this strong drive to give dignity and respect to dead bodies, and how that might work in an end of life scenario where organ donation is the end point.
I think it's often a concern that there will be a tension, and certainly some physicians or some ethicists worry that this might preclude donation. Are we harming a family? But my understanding from the research in this field is that the majority of families, when they have that opportunity, if they make a decision for donation, they will sort of the benefits to them, and they know this is what their loved one would have wanted. It's not ideal, it's not perfect, but few deaths, I guess, are ideal and perfect, and the joy or the comfort that it can bring by being able to have even just the opportunity for donation, even if donation then proves to be unsuccessful, I think that generally speaking is best for them. And if they, as Rohit says, if they're counselled and they say this is not for us, then that's something then they don't proceed with. But I think it is most important that they make that informed decision and that they're aware of what that process might become.
A friend was telling me the other day about a case they knew of where a man had wanted to donate his organs after he died, but the timing meant that he had to have many more interventions than he wanted and had explicitly stated that he wanted in his advanced care plan. And so is there a point where that gets pushed to an ethically troubling place?
I think practically with anything we do in hospitals, it's a matter of benefits and risk. And the most important thing, I think, when I'm doing my job or a donor coordinator is doing their job, is that they present this to the family in an honest way, and respect that it's the family's. They're in the best possible position to represent that person most of the time, and as a result, if they feel that the burdens, if for want of a better word, of everything that's continuing in the intensive care outweigh what that person would have wanted to help others, then so be it. I think it's very important that we are cognizant and respectful of those things. But for most families, I think they recognise that there are, it may increase the time frames a little bit. It doesn't necessarily have to, but it can, and the good that's coming out of the donation process, someone being helped, the comfort that they might get in the knowledge that someone's being helped outweighs that.
I was wondering about the lasting impact on family members. Do they feel ultimately the good has outweighed the difficulty, or does it depend on a case-by-case basis? And I was also wondering, do they like to meet with the recipients? Does that help them?
Yeah, so to answer the first question, I think it varies. Most families do report back to us months or years down the track, and we have the setup we have in all states and territories in Australia is that there is contact with if that's what the family chooses, with the donation agency over time, and the ability to have counselling if necessary, or pointing people in the right direction for appropriate resources. But they have contact with us, and it can vary. For some, the experience is positive with when all things being balanced, and for some it's not. When they look back on it, they have questions or doubts, and we work through those with families. As for the second question, I think Dominique's probably. I was going to
flick that to me.
Yeah.
It's certainly something that some families in Australia and in other countries feel very strongly they would like to be able to meet face to face with the people who have received organs or tissues that have been donated by their own loved one. It's not something that is legally possible at the moment in Australia, but you may have read there have been some stories, there have been some television programs where people have connected via social media usually, or after reading newspaper articles, and then had these meetings. And in Israel and in the United States, where it's been legal for about 20 years, there are families who meet with recipients. it's still very rare, because the ethical conditions of that usually, and most people agree with this, is that both parties should make an informed decision, and this should be something that they want. And the way, I guess, the preferences that people might have about meeting are probably like most of our preferences at a time of grief. They're subject to change. So people might feel in the immediate aftermath of a loss that they don't want to meet. They never want to hear anything about the recipients. Others might feel I'd like to meet them right now. And then over time, that might change, I guess, as they move through the grieving process. And so it's really important that, I guess, that decision is made at a time where they can make it as best as possible, because I think it's very hard to predict how you will feel when you meet the other party, and depending on the person or the family, if they've invested a lot emotionally in what that experience might be like, or who those recipients might be. In most cases, experience internationally suggests it goes well, but sometimes it doesn't go so well. And the flip side, of course, is for recipients, transplant recipients, it can be incredibly difficult. Many of them, or most of them, they want to express their gratitude, but having to meet with the family of someone who has died and who's made their life possible is really, I think, psychologically can be burdensome. It can be amazing, but something that, again, they need to be able to make an informed decision and have appropriate support for.
And can it change your sense of self to know that someone else's organs or corneas or tissue is inside you, keeping you alive?
Certainly there have been, anecdotally, people will report that it's probably best to have a psychologist here to talk about the way that or an anthropologist about the way those beliefs are shaped. Certainly some people, there have been case reports in the medical literature saying, all of my preferences for what I like to do in life, the sorts of people I got along with, the food that I enjoyed, all of them changed after I had this transplant, often when it's something like a heart transplant. But I believe recently some scientific evidence is emerging that you can, for example, develop an allergy to things after having an organ. I think there have been a couple of case reports. So it may be mediating some things in your body, but I think that idea about how the personality of the donor might shape you is something which is probably more about moving through that emotional process of receiving an organ from someone who's died.
Pia, do you ever work with families who want you to work with them but also want to go through the donation process?
I've certainly had clients who have donated organs to scientific research, or have wanted to donate their body to science, but maybe perhaps didn't do it in time. And so then the family feels like they haven't been able to deliver on that person's final wishes. But particularly when I'm dressing someone who has had recent surgery or post-mortem surgery, some families want to see every mark. They want to see every part. They want to absorb every part of that person's physicality. Others do not, and they do not want to see that person has been touched post-death, and that changes the garment. Maybe it's a higher neck. Maybe there are a tight ribbon around a hat so that hat is not going to come off. It's case by case, and sometimes families want to see, and particularly if there's been a traumatic, violent death. Usually families don't necessarily want to see all of that. And so part of the dressing is about discussing with them the parts of the body that they do want to see.
And I'm looking at your clothes online. They're just beautiful. They're beautiful fabrics. They're gauzy. They're made for practicality in that you can dress a dead body in them easily rather than trying to struggle someone into their Sunday best, which must be so traumatic for people. Is it important to you that they're beautiful?
That the garments are beautiful?
Yeah.
Beauty is in the eye of the beholder. I
started out in fashion design, so
my philosophy with my palette of materials that I draw from is particularly around natural fibres, silks, wools, linens, etc. But I encourage families that, and particularly the client, the person who I usually work with the person who the garment is for. And often they want to incorporate things from their existing wardrobe into what becomes their final garment. And God, some of them are ugly and horrible. But that's my aesthetic choice. For them, it is the epitome of beautiful, and therefore that makes it beautiful for them. So, I preference things like good finish, and the seams need to be neat and cut off loose threads. But whether or not it's beautiful is to the family. And I mean, I think all of them are beautiful, but each to their own.
Well, what's that process like for someone to work with you on something that they know is going to be with them when they're not there and their body is gradually being embraced by the earth?
It's a moment of control in something that you have very little control over. They know that this is what they will be wearing, and that tends to bring them some security in, at least I know this is the next stage. And, you know, depending on how far they want to go down the deterioration role of this is what happens to wool, this is what happens to silk, wool is protein-based like skin, you know, some do, some don't. But it's very, I mean, it's transformative because fashion is something that we all engage with, we all wear clothes. Some clients want to go out naked. Legally, that's very difficult to facilitate. So then it becomes about, well, maybe you just need to be wrapped in a cotton sheet. But for others, it's this celebration. Maybe they never got married, so this is their big dress. Some never wear it after it's been delivered to them while they're alive. And so it's something that is only going to be worn when they're dead. So it's almost something that, not that they're looking forward to, but they're looking forward to. Like, this is when I will get to wear it. And
Are you standing in for faith, or are you working with people of faith? Because it sometimes seems to me that art fills that gap, that feeling of control and safety and meaning.
It can be really blended. It's certainly about creating ritual that is authentic to that person and for that family. So sometimes it is in replacement of, you know, religious ritual, but not exclusively. When you make these garments with the person, you talk about things like what their favourite colour is, what they like to wear every day, what they like to touch, what sensory input they like, which is, you know, they won't feel it post-death. But they then start explaining, well, when my mother dressed me in this, or when I wore this. So it becomes about storytelling and about their life and what they love about life. So in talking about their death, in a very literal sense, this is what your body will decompose in. To then be able to reflect on what they love about life is actually very uplifting for them.
And you've done a lot of work with working out how decomposition works. Tell us about the pigs.
So I was looking at how do fibres degrade within the context of natural burial. So no embalming, no coffin, shallow grave, and how long does it take for them to decompose? So I dressed and named and washed and then buried 21 pigs. And every 50 days for a year, I would go and dig up 3 of them. Part of that was, yes, the scientific evidence, if it takes, 50 to 100 days for protein-based fibres to decompose or plant-based fibres, then protein fibres, and synthetics around forever. But part of it was also about learning what happens to a body and facing where disgust happens. And that was what the main outcome of that piece of research was, for me personally, was, okay, the corpse, there's lots of theory around objection and, oh my God, this is the most disgusting, awful, horrifying, I'm facing my own mortality type situation. But when on that spectrum from the minute of death through to skeletonization does that occur? So a lot of it was about facing these in-between moments of decomposition and disintegration and ultimately what I see is a reabsorption.
And for you, that moment was when it became dry.
Yes.
That was really interesting.
Yes, it's the liquid in between when you're not quite sure what belongs where. Is it soil? Is it body? Is it garment? That's really unnerving. But the moment you are reaching back to a skeletal structure, skeletons we are very culturally au fait with dealing with.
Yeah, it's fine to go to an ossuary in Europe and
Absolutely.
Look at bones in a church, isn't
Yep.
it? It's the in-between bits.
Yep.
I want to shift back to organs, from the fluids to the organs. Let's transition. I was reading recently that we've managed to grow liver-like tissue from stem cells from liposuction, of all places, and you can do that in 9 days. I'm wondering if we're looking at a time when we won't need organ transplants anymore.
I think we probably will, and it might be sooner than we think, which is probably a good thing, because it would mean more people are able to be helped. We have, we don't have waiting lists. We don't have concerns over, medical issues with or uncertainties about the function or of organs. So I think, there's a lot of research that's occurring at the moment that will probably preclude the need for people donating organs.
So you won't need consent anymore?
Well, I think that's a whole different, because a lot of these technologies will require the actual product has to be generated from something of human origin, I would anticipate. But
I think we've got, as I understand, again, it seems to involve a lot of pigs, this research, but it's probably going to be, 20 years before,
something like
hypothetically,
that
might resolve at least some of the challenges. But let's say it does, we're still, I think, going to have a lot of the same ethical and social, potentially legal, certainly clinical questions around this matter of death and the dying process. If, for example, we can keep someone biologically alive on the machines, or by replacing parts of their body with synthesised materials, at what point then do we say this is no longer the person who began or started life with their own human biological cells? If we've now replaced them with either cloned ones or grown in the lab ones, or a body transplant, for example, are they still that same person? And again, those challenges are probably some years ahead of us, but I think there'll be new challenges for us to deal with.
It's time to write a few PhDs between now and then, luckily. Dominique, I wanted to continue that thread, because I know there are lots of problems at the moment with the nexus between the organ donation regimes in other places around the world, and maybe even here, and the capitalist system. And you've been doing some research on what an effective organ donation regime would look like that was also ethical. Can you tell us what an ideal system might look like?
An ideal system would be, in my opinion, where everyone who has that opportunity to become a deceased donor of organs and tissues has that opportunity and makes an informed decision and chooses that voluntarily. That would be perfect. In the absence of that, I think the best systems are ones in which we have, as we're privileged to have in Australia, a very effective, reliable, trustworthy healthcare system, where if you go into the Royal Melbourne Hospital or some other hospital down the road here, if someone says to you or says to your family, this person is now dead, would you like for them, or is this what they would have wanted, to become an organ donor, to be able to proceed and have that happen. And I think we're doing that very well in Australia. We still have, of course, people who are uncertain about the decision, and we need to continue to support the community to think about those decisions and think about perhaps the ethical and the social and the clinical complexities around it. In other countries, however, it's not always so easy. It may be because people can't actually walk into or be taken into the Royal Melbourne Hospital to have the treatment they need to potentially save their life. And where a decision about switching off a machine is not because the person is dead, but rather because the family can't afford to continue receiving medical care. And in those circumstances, when people are making decisions about donation, or where perhaps families are being offered money to make a positive decision about donation, that makes it very ethically problematic. And unsurprisingly, people in those societies tend not to be very in favour of organ donation because there is a conflict of interest. And so that's something that I guess many of, particularly developing countries, big countries like India and China now, which have all of the medical infrastructure but still have very big social challenges to overcome, and they're currently working to try and develop their deceased donation systems. Not sure if that quite answers the question, but...
Well, there'll be a chance in about 5 minutes to ask, and if you've got any gaps that need filling, hold on to those questions for Dominique and Rohit and Pia. Rohit, you helped develop the training materials for Donate Life for medical professionals. What makes a family say yes when they're in that grieving state, that may be a traumatised state, and they're having a conversation with their doctor? What's the tipping point that you've seen?
Yeah, I think something that Pia was talking about really resonated in the with the organ donation kind of space as well. I think so much that a family has gone through involves no choice. And as adults, most of us have choice. And, we're privileged to have that choice, but we enjoy it, we take it for granted. And then all of a sudden, choice is taken away from that individual and that family. And here, we are suddenly offering something that, again, they have a choice about. And I think that's, when we think about death, that's what perhaps is the bit that's scariest and hardest to deal with about it, is that this feeling that we're going to be disempowered. And it doesn't have to be that way. I mean, there's lots of, as you've explored in your series, there's lots of aspects that we actually do have some choices about, and organ donation is one of those things. And that for many families, that can be very empowering. And whether that decision is yes or no, it doesn't have to be yes. It is here a clinician who up to this point may have I'm kind of this is not how we operate, obviously, but we're telling everyone this is what's happening, and then all of a sudden here I'm coming to you and asking you, what do you think they would have wanted? What do you think, you know them the best? What does this represent them?
I did think that I saw you nodding when Pia was talking about, their life. Let's focus on their life and the things from their life that they loved and valued, and maybe that's something.
And that's the other thing. The thing I find most rewarding as a doctor in intensive care, often I don't get to speak to my patients at all. And because either they're most of them are getting better, which is great, but by the time they're able to speak, I'm discharging them to the ward, and I don't get to really sit down and have a conversation with them. I do get to speak to families a lot, but here's an opportunity to actually talk about that person. And I try to do that early, not necessarily when organ donation is being discussed, but I try to find out a bit more about them, because it actually makes me makes me happier in my work. It enriches the experience for me, as well as hopefully for the family. And a big part of that is what their choices would have been. And a lot of people have thought a lot about whether they would want to be an organ donor, or it might just be very obvious to them. They're very pragmatic, or whatever, for whatever reason they want to. And this brings them into the room, even though they can't be there.
Was at an event recently celebrating the life of a young man who died of leukemia. And the specialist who treated him was there, and he said, I don't usually go to funerals, but I made an exception. I was thinking, how do doctors deal with the constant presence of death in their lives? Is it a self-preservation thing? I won't go to the funeral for that person.
Yeah, look, it's a good question. I think it probably varies. There are some moments when someone's, the tragedy that a family is going through is so close to home that you need to actually maybe sometimes step out of there and say, look, I need to hand this over to someone else. Most of the time, I'm focused on trying to do a good job and trying to be there for the family. And, I feel, because I'm human, just like anyone else. And if it means that I go away from this scene and have a little bit of a cry, that's okay. I think that's healthy. What happens most of the time is, I think, we for right or wrong, we focus on the tasks that are at hand with that particular patient and that family, and I guess with that there is naturally a little bit of a distance that is protective, but every time there's every now and then there's things that permeate that.
Well, and Pia, it must be interesting for you negotiating all those emotions that come up, even though you feel you're doing good for the people.
Look, it's certainly something that I have learnt as I've kind of moved through doing this, because the first people I addressed were my family, my grandparents, and then it was extended family, and then it was a high school friend's dad, and then it was strangers, and there's traumatic deaths and beautiful deaths, but when if I've had a client for 6 to 10 months, when they die, it is a little bit, because I know them, I'm actually friends with them at that point. But for the most part, when I'm working with a family, that person is not mine. They're not my dead. They're not my family, my community, and I'm there to fulfill a role, which is to help the family and to help that person through this. And believe me, I become emotionally attached, but they're not mine to grieve. And so I hold those deaths really differently, and I just see it as absolute privilege and honour to be able to be with someone, and I only get to meet them because of their death. And I never would have met these families had it not been for this person's death and their dead body that needs addressing.
I'd love to hear your thoughts on these things that we've been chatting about today. There are a couple of people with microphones, one on either side, so if you put your hand up, someone will come to you. And you can address your question to Dominique or Rohit or Pia or all three.
Thank you. Thank you. That was incredible. I was wondering, and it's a question for all of you, whoever wants to answer. In art, there's this idea of the memento mori. So in a still life, you'll put a skull with the idea of reminding us sort of how to live. And I was thinking, obviously, you look death in the face daily. How has that changed how you live?
I think that's a really good question, and it really, there are times when you, at the end of your day, you go home and you realise how great it is to live. And there's times when you feel, well, it's not so great to live. It's, this is not a good day. But yet, I do look at moments and think of what I've been blessed with. I really do.
I can become consumed in the small stuff, my day-to-day work, teaching, stresses, admin, and then I will go and do a death, and it cuts through the BS. And I'll drive home from doing a dressing and call my mum or call my dad or call my best friend for a chat and a catch-up and an I love you. And so what it does remind you of your own mortality, and everything is not a given, it's a gift. And so it just reaffirms life. And I think I don't get depressed by the work that I do. I love the work that I do because it is so full of life.
Dominique, on the surface, your work is kind of at one remove from death, but are there times when it pierces through?
It is and it isn't. In the sort of ethical work that I do, we're often talking about death, and when I'm teaching ethics, we philosophers, bioethicists, we often bring up life and death examples because they're a great way to get people to sort of confront. We think they're a great way to get people to confront their ethical opinions about things. And often I feel I'm flippant or disrespectful, or even when we think things through carefully, it's still quite theoretical. And I think that's the challenge for people who are making policy or legislation or ethical guidelines or clinical guidelines around death, is that you need to try and really hang on to the reality. And sometimes often having a person in the room who has had that direct experience recently, or a patient, just a normal person who can be there and actually say, hang on, this is death we're talking about, this is what death is like for real people. And that can be very helpful to us, I think, in making better policy and legislation.
I stopped eating meat for a year after my father died, and then the effect just wore off. Back to making thoughtless life decisions, sadly. Next question.
Thank you. Look, this is a hard question to frame, but basically I'm just wondering, for you people that work right there all the time, where is our culture going in terms of, we're moving away from religion so much and the answers it used to give us, and I'm just wondering, what are you seeing? Where is our culture going? What are people really feeling about the spirit afterlife, if there is any, or maybe are people open to it, or what's happening out there in our culture?
I'm seeing a lot of people returning back to basics and things like natural burial, because the body is something that you can donate back to the earth, back to the soil. It fertilizer is blood, bone, shit. And so your body is this bearer of new life. You sort of borrow. So a lot of people are kind of going with physics and science-based principles of an afterlife. because we know that those are happening. We know that the body will break down and be reabsorbed. And you're getting a lot of people who say, well, I don't care, just, don't spend a lot of money, just put me in the backyard and plant a tree on me. And that might be an economic, it might be, less of a cultural or religious ideal, but this idea of simplicity and holding on to what actually matters, which is, I really liked this type of beer, so can you all go to the pub and put that on tap for everyone? So we're moving back to much more of a personalised, authentic type of ceremony. And so I don't know whether that answers your question in terms of where we're heading as a society, but I'm hoping that by personalising death, we become nicer to other people. And we do return to this idea that we are mortal and this is fleeting and it's not given and it's temporary, and having a respect for other people. I'm hoping it's going in a positive direction. And that's what I see in the work. You see community come together. You see people profoundly changed by these experiences of deaths, because a death in your lifetime punctuates your life and actually stays with you for the rest of your life. So,
right. You probably see a very wide cross-section of the community, people from all different kinds of faith backgrounds. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think we have a range of people, and whether it's ritual, you might have people who have not attended a church for 30, 40 years. We always offer them the opportunity for a chaplain or a priest, and they said, oh no, I think he wasn't religious, we're not religious, but we would like the Catholic priest to come, because it provides some meaning for them. And I think, those things are so important to try and enable if possible.
And like Pierre said, it's almost like a punctuation point, isn't it? This is the point where we acknowledge that this person is dying.
And yes, that's right. Absolutely.
Dominic, did you want to add anything?
I think amongst some members of the society, there's also new ways that people are trying to find meaning in the afterlife, and obviously for millennials, for other people, that afterlife for some can be perceived as lying in the internet or social media, ways in which we have perhaps established now when we increasingly live our lives. So when someone dies, people create a Facebook memorial page. People worry about not just their intellectual property, but who will manage, the photos, the stories that they've left behind. And people, I think, will also do a lot of that storytelling about death via those internet media. So that's also something which I personally find a little bit confronting, and I'm personally more in favour of going the natural route. But I think we're trying to make new ways of meaning in the new ways that we now live our lives.
We've got time for another couple of questions, I think.
I was really enjoying the talk and I'm fascinated by the topic, but I'm just wondering, in relation to organ donation, why in some cases the living are able to override the wishes of the dead, when people have said they do want to donate their organs, but their next of kin is able to contradict that.
Yeah, I think that's a very good question, and it's I think this I would, if we had this situation where someone had clearly established their, expressed their wish and had talked about it, and all of a sudden the family goes, oh no, we're not. And it's never as simple as that. It's often that someone may have registered a donation wish many, many years ago, and has subsequently had, they've, with their loved ones, had multiple conversations where maybe it's not so clear that they support that wish anymore. They may have changed their mind. I've had an instance where someone was registered many years ago, and the family said, look, it's really, we find that quite surprising, because they couldn't read or write. So we're not sure whether they've made a mistake, because we've had a conversation with them, and they've talked about donation. I don't think they would have supported it. And sometimes it is a situation where, due to a variety of circumstances, it is just too overwhelmingly distressing for that family to go through with the process, and they recognise, they say, look, I know my loved one would have wanted this, but they wouldn't want to see us like this either. And I know that probably trumps what they've said then. And in those situations, who am I to, or anyone really who's known that family and probably has never known that person, to say, well, actually, no, here we've got it in black and white, I'm sorry. So it's complicated, but in most circumstances we rely on the premise that person who's representing that person knows them the best and is representing their interests, and overwhelmingly I suspect that's the case.
Bring on the liposuction livers then, so that we don't have to make the choice at that difficult time. Another question?
Is there a difference between the idea of opting out versus opting in around organ donation, and is there a difference in how medical practitioners think about it and ethicists?
Do you want to go first, or do you want me to?
Sure. There's an ethical or a legal difference. There are different models of opting out or opting in systems. So, for example, we think of Australia's system as opting in because people make an individual choice prospectively, I'd like to be a donor, or the family makes that decision for them at the time of their death. In an opt-out system, there's a presumption that everyone has already effectively opted in. Everyone is willing to donate unless they've said no. So you have to express a wish rather than to donate. You have to express that you don't want to donate. So ethically, that's different. But if we were able to reliably make that assumption about our very culturally, linguistically, socially diverse community in Australia, and we felt confident that everyone would be willing, and we provided a system for people to make a choice to opt out, that's something that we could do. But in practice, in countries like Spain and Croatia, which have had decades of the opt-out system and which have been very successful in deceased donation, they still actually ask every family to make that decision, even though there's a presumption that everyone is willing. And about 20% of those families will still say no for the sorts of reasons that Rohit mentioned. So it's ethically relatively easy, but to put it into practice ethically, it often takes a bit of fudging, I guess, in the process.
Rohit, do you want to add
Yeah,
anything?
so I completely agree with everything Dominic said. In terms of, and we've thought about this because there have been recent legislative changes in the United Kingdom, for example. So we've thought about how, as a clinician, we might phrase the conversation, and it's subtly different, but ultimately it's never going to be a system, a so-called hard opt-out system where we say, look, if you haven't opted out, well, too late, sorry. Because that would be completely alien to the way we practice healthcare in this country. So we would always go to the family and we would say, look, they haven't expressed a wish again they haven't expressed an objection. So we're going to give you some more information, and then you're in the best position to make that determination.
It's a biggie, isn't it? Just quickly, Dominic, I was struck by part of your work that says we should stop thinking about organ donation as an altruistic thing. What's the alternative?
There are a few alternatives. I think one way that I think culturally we're shifting towards is thinking of it more as a form of solidarity, where rather than thinking, I've made this exceptional decision, I'm going to give the gift of life to someone if I die and can become a donor, we think, what can we do together to help one another meet our needs for transplantation? And I think that's the way most Australians think about it collectively. We're not thinking, I'm going to be a superhero and I'll save the life of that person over there. We just see this as something that we do that for a small proportion of people might become a routine part of that dying process. The opportunity comes up, you can help to save the lives of other people. And that's something that I think we need to do for one another. And the reason we can do that in Australia is because we have this fair and equitable, transparent system in which we can trust that we're helping one another, that it's not just from one group to another group.
Look, thank you so much for coming tonight. A big hand to Dominic Martin, Rohit Da Costa and Pierre Interlandi.
Visit wheelercentre.com for the best in books, writing and ideas from Melbourne, Australia and the world.